as published?
I do.
Okay.
Just a minor thing. See if I can find it in here somewhere. I won't find it in that. Yeah, on page 4, I brought up the issue about the issues of flood insurance. And I just noted that I had gotten mine and the bill had gone up, and I was worried about my neighbors because I got it a year before the flooding. So it was inexpensive. But for those around me are paying, thousands of dollars. And I was inquiring about changing the flood rating of the area once the 180 Schultz Creek project. And the insurance company had told me that that the city is the entity that does that change it. And we'll talk about that later, I'm guessing. So the point was I was bringing it up for the neighborhood, not just because of my personal flood insurance. I wasn't worried about that. So just to set the record straight a little.
What is the specific change you want to make to the?
Just say if it was done, in the spirit of helping my neighbors with their insurance, basically.
Anybody have any other amendments or revisions? No? Okay, can I get a motion to approve with John's amendment?
I make a motion to approve with the amendment.
Okay, all those in favor say aye. Or wait, I need a second. Anybody want a second? All right, thanks, Malcolm. Okay, all in favor say aye. Any opposed? Oh, okay, we carry. Item 3 is public participation. Public participation enables the public to address the commission about an item that is not on the agenda. If you wish to address the commission, please state your name and address for the record. The Arizona Open Meeting Law prohibits the commission from discussing or taking action on an item which is not listed on the prepared agenda. The commission members may, however, respond to criticism made by those addressing the commission, ask staff to review a matter, or ask that a matter be placed on a future agenda. Public comments should be limited to 3 minutes reading time. So do we have anybody that would like to move forward public participation? Going once, going twice. Okay, move on. Item 4, new business. 4A, spring routine flood mitigation and response update, stormwater from Ed Shank. So let's go through that. Thank you, Ed.
I'm Chase McLeod. I'm filling in for Ed. I'm a project manager for stormwater here at the city. And yeah, I'll be going through the post-wildfire flooding update. Some objectives, we'll talk about spruce wasp, Schultz Creek, getting ready for monsoon season, any questions you may have, and flood insurance information. Here's just a graphic of our burned watersheds and our water courses. First, I'll go through spruce wash. I'll be kind of talking about milestones, where we are with construction and design, kind of go through some construction impacts, modeling, and preparing for this monsoon season. I won't go really too much into these milestones, but the big one was the first one, November 22. Prop 441 passes, and that gets everything going. We got all our design team, got a CMAR on board. Everything's close to being designed and construction has started. Here's kind of a suite of projects, starting from Killip Elementary going up just past Linda Vista. I'll go a little more into detail than this. First project, Grandview Drive reconstruction. So that's what it looks like right now. Once they're complete, it's going to be an inverted crown. They've already finished utility relocations, and they're starting on the curb gutter roadway right now. Next project is the Wedge Detention Basin. This is a huge project. This is pushing water from the just upstream of the Linda Vista crossing, going down to the wedge right there. And then that'll be bled off into storm drains under Cedar. Linda Vista crossing, here it is right now. That's what a rendering of what it will look like. Way more capacity. And then to the right, you can see the inlet to get to the Wedge Detention Basin. From Linda Vista down to Cedar, here's the current, guess you can call it natural open channel. That's what it'll look like after concrete, give it a little more capacity. Once we get to Cedar Crossing, there's the current crossing. It's undersized right now. Put more capacity under Cedar. Arroyo Seco channel, so going from Dortha to the inlet near Arroyo Seco townhomes. This will be removing the existing 60-inch storm drain underneath that channel and making a much larger concrete channel. There'll also be a new inlet right at Arroyo Seco townhomes, as well as an inlet to get push water to the regional detention basins that are already constructed, as well as a new outlet that'll connect to 6th Ave. Some construction impacts, Linda Vista road closure, that's a big one this spring to next spring because of all these different projects. They need to close that down. You can see the detour if you're up in Shadow Mountain. This spring, this month, next month, there are, as I do utility relocates near Linda Vista, there's going to be some impact to water pressure. We haven't noticed much yet, but we're monitoring that. Modeling. Here are the draft results of what it'll look like. Everything, all the projects completed that you can see existing on the left. In the middle, that's what it will look like. And this is proposed, this is draft. This is not final. You can see the change, and yeah, this is for the 2-inch storm. Going down south of Cedar, you can see the impacts there. And near Killip Elementary, those regional detention basins and the townhomes will see a huge impact.
Excuse me if I may, what are we, how should we interpret the pink color on this?
The pink is, I believe, the reduction, the change on the far right. Yeah. So you can see less than a foot water depth change. Back.
Yeah, so as a sample, if you could walk us through that previous one from left to right. So you say existing and then.
Yep, this is what it, sorry, can you hear me? This is what it looks like right now. The existing model with the burned watershed, no projects complete. In the middle, every project complete. You can see the flood depths we have. Still, Maine could see some water, but mostly contained within the roadway prison. And again, I just want to emphasize, these are draft, these are not final results. Here's back to Killip Regional Detention Basins. You can see that in the middle, you can see the inlet going to the, and the either channel or underground pipe going to the regional detention basin. Next, I'll talk about Schultz Creek. There's kind of
Excuse me, would you like to take questions at the end, or
Yeah.
should we ask as we go here?
I'm
happy to wait to the end.
Yeah, I'd probably prefer end. Going over to Schultz Creek, here's kind of infographic. Here's kind of highlighting some of the projects that are being constructed or have been constructed. There's been on-force work. We know the detention basins. stabilization projects in city limits for Schultz Creek, work on Stavana Way, and yeah, the big one is the 180 crossing. That's the long-term mitigation, about 7 million to complete. We're still on track for July 1st completion date. That's a dual 8x5 concrete box culvert going under 180 under Grand Canyon Trust property. And then it'll fan out, kind of alluvial fan structure you can see right here. So this is all open. And I was just out there Tuesday, and they've got this area, they've got most of the concrete structure underneath, and they're working towards 180. Here you can see that's on Grand Canyon Trust. It's just massive shoring. It's a really huge project. Our designers, SWI Adura, Bannekeys, the CMAR, and obviously ADOT and county is involved as well. Here's a look inside one of the pipes. Prepping for this monsoon season. For Grandview residents, our Eagle Mountain had to remove all the sandbags that were lining the property, kind of making that a channel. They're not putting back sandbags. We do have a model. I haven't showed it yet, but it's a model of what it'll look like with the inverted crown. So we're recommending residents to protect their structure with sandbags appropriately with the new model. There's a little change with the inverted crown. And then we have the call center up, so we're providing assistance. And south of Grandview, no changes. Just if there's damaged outward facing sandbags to replace those. For Schultz Creek, during monsoon season, after July 1st, when they construct that, we won't have much time to do removal, as we'll be doing monsoon preparedness and mostly flood response, so we won't have as much time. But if there's good sandbags, you can put those back at Thorpe Park near Aztec. Flood insurance, I'm not a flood insurance agent, but all I know is it's a separate policy from your homeowners. You can get it on the FEMA's website. We're a class 5 community in the CRS program, meaning if you're getting NFIP policy through FEMA, it's a 25% discount. And there's a 30-day waiting period usually to get that policy. FEMA remapping, I'm not as familiar with this, but I know we're waiting on a grant that could be 2 to 3 years or until we get it programmed into our stormwater budget. These are big letter of map revisions, could be 100K per watershed, and takes a lot of back and forth between FEMA to get these remapped officially. We have a flood prevention grant, through our sustainability office. It's up to $5,000 for flood proofing materials, sealants, floodgates, things like that. Yeah, I can take questions now.
Could you go back to that image of the Schultz underpass? There it was. Yeah. If I'm reading that correctly, it looks like that culvert still has a pretty substantial dog leg in it.
I'm not familiar with a dog leg.
Well, it's that part that looks like it passes underneath 180.
Mm-hmm. At
To
the
get
angle.
the main part of the culvert that runs more or less straight out to the Rio de Flag.
Yeah. I don't have an answer for you right now, but I can definitely look into that with our designer. We can get back to you with that.
Yeah, I'm just curious why they opted for that as opposed to a straight shot or a straighter shot to the Rio de Flag.
Yeah, this isn't probably a good answer, but we basically, the best option was to go through the Grand Canyon Trust property. So we kind of had to angle it that way. based off property rights and what we could buy.
Thank you.
Do you know what the capacity, cubic feet per second is for that structure?
I think it's around 900 to 1200 CFS, but don't quote me on that. If you want an exact answer, I could get you one upcoming.
A question on flood insurance on behalf of John. The map revision, I believe according to ordinance, has to be done 6 months after completion of the project. Normally, it would have already been, you would have had an existing model and then, which you do have. And then, you know, the model for the post-construction for the improvements. And usually that's done with what's called a conditional letter of map revision,
Yep.
CLOMAR, which theoretically would already be done. And then when the project's done, it just gets rubber stamped and it's approved. You don't have to use a discharge based on new hydrology. You use the existing discharge, which is, I think it's just a little over 100 CFS on this water course. It's not much. So to wait, when I read your slide that said at least 2 years to do the model, you have to, you just use the existing FEMA discharge, and the hydraulics are relatively simple. And I would urge you guys to do that sooner than later, because every year, every month costs people a lot of money. And double check the regulations. I think it has to be done in 6 months from completion. I'm not sure about that.
Yeah.
It's been a while.
Yeah, follow up to my earlier question. Is there some kind of screening device or structure at the upstream end of the culvert?
There's a quasi sedimentation basin, hopefully to let some of that sediment settle. We had a better basin, but based off construction costs, we had to get rid of that. We're hoping all the on-service, on-force work with all the stabilization we did in city limits help with sedimentation.
Yeah, I understand the issues with sedimentation. I'm more concerned about the issues with debris. And certainly there are a lot of photos of what the upstream end of Schultz Creek looked like just to the east of 180, and the amount of debris that comes down that drainage on flood events is nothing short of amazing. And if that stuff isn't being screened out, before it gets into the culvert, the culvert's going to get trashed pretty quickly.
Yep, understood. Yeah, we took that in consideration. Spruce, Schultz Creek passes through those detention basins, so any larger debris will get caught there. And then we have the ability to maintain that basin.
Thank you.
Commissioner Bay.
Yeah, my question's on the Spruce Wash. If there are more questions on Schultz Creek, you should maybe finish that up first. Yeah, back on Spruce Wash, could you describe the function of the wedge again? I did not follow what the design concept is there. I've seen the construction across from the Safeway store, and it's kind of a puzzlement how that's going to work.
Yeah. So downstream, we don't have enough capacity. We have to bleed off. I forget what the CFS is, but maybe 100 to 300 CFS. As everything's passing through the rest of the wash, once that passes through, we'll start bleeding off this detention basin, and hopefully the channel won't be full of water, and we can kind of bleed it off that way.
Okay, so it's an alternative route for the water to take.
Yep.
Is that passive in the sense that the, or
We're
are there
working through that.
any pumps involved, or is that passive?
It's passive. As far as how we discharge it, that's still being designed. If that's going to be automatic or manual gate, or they're still working through a couple options.
Thank you.
What's the capacity of that basin?
I don't know that number off the top of my head.
I've done some walking up in that area, and there's a couple of retention basins, I'm guessing towards the upper inlet of that.
Mhm.
What's the state of that? I haven't been up there for a little while.
Those are complete. We're just about to do final walkthrough.
Do you know what the capacity of those? Is there two up there?
There's
just
more,
one?
there's more than two.
Okay.
I forget the capacity, but those are more for sedimentation, dropping out sediment rather than retaining water.
Two questions. One, just in general, when it comes to detention basins, how do we feel that we are set in terms of they are, I'll say empty, but cleaned out, if you will, to a state of satisfaction? That's the first question. Second one is, we spent a lot of time last year talking about Waterline Road and the reconstruction and the damage, and if I think I got the road name correct, but it's the water line from, and how is the status of that? Do we feel good about that going into this monsoon season? So detention, general detention, clean out, and then also how do we feel about Waterline?
Question one, how we feel about maintenance of our detention basin, if I'm understanding correctly. Yeah, so in our stormwater rate study that was passed a little bit, we added more funding for maintenance, talking in millions. So more equipment, more staff to maintain all this new infrastructure we'll be getting. That's my comment on that. Water line, I'm really not familiar with that project. I don't know, Shannon, if you have any updates, but
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I can provide a brief update on the Interbasin Waterline Road. So we know some of the armoring that was done last year did see some damage even from the runoff. So that's going to be restored, and they're making further mitigations on that. It was shut down right through the winter, and that crew is remobilizing, I believe, next week. They're rolling back in to start that. So that process continues. It'll continue through this year, and we'll continue to assess, but they are working through armoring and continue to reassess that. So I think that is going well. The pipeline, of course, has been repaired. And so we're anticipating that we'll be using that the North Reservoir plant to bring drinking water in, but to continue to work and getting access further up. They did restore access, and so now a lot of the work is just that armoring and continuing to work through where they're seeing how that dynamic changes.
Thank you.
So at the last meeting, I had asked for an update on the Rio de Flag Headwaters pre-fire study, County Commission Flood Control District. And so by way of background, there was some emails and not everyone here was included. Mr. Chair, I think you were. And the discussion had to do with the County Flood Control District doing watershed management, tree thinning, and so forth in the upper Rio watershed. And there was an email from Ed that indicated that the Rio de Flag project would be able to handle most of those post-fire floods, which then led us off into, well, what's going on here? If the Rio project is going to handle these flows, then why is the county doing this? So I'm going to try to read this if it's okay with you guys. Dry throat and all. So the question is about the upper Rio forest thinning. There was an article in the paper that indicated that the city would experience extreme flooding. NAU even produced cost of damages. And then, like I said before, the Rio project can handle most of these flows, according to Ed. So a couple of questions. You don't have to answer these. And as I speak, the ice gets thinner for me, and I apologize ahead of time. Did the flood control district study consider the core project and its ability to handle these increased flows? Did the city have any impact into this project? I'm assuming the answers to these questions might be no. I encourage the city and the flood control district to develop a formal project review process. And lastly, I'm aware that forest management has many benefits that are not related to flooding. I'm specifically talking about flooding. And that's it. Thank you.
So not this, well, there, slight question in the sense of, do we know if there was a coordination effort between the city and county on that before that thinning, or just the county just fired off and did it? By any chance?
Is that specific to the thinning or to the presentation that was given to the county supervisor?
Just the flood control district project.
San Francisco Peaks pre-wildfire assessment of post-fire flood risk. Was done by J. Fuller, Hydrology and Geomorphology Incorporated.
Yeah, so definitely, so I'm gonna go out on a limb and we'll let Ed come back and kind of clear that up. So I would like to say that the water services didn't have a direct involvement, through that. I will say though that we do work, closely with the county, but I also know that there's different lenses, and a lot of stuff going on at the same time and what's prudent. So I do feel we have a really good working relationship with the county and their flood district. I think specific to that, I do not believe water services had a direct, interaction with that. And again, so unfortunately, our representatives from like J. E. Fuller and Ed were at a conference with also the county's flood district. They're also at that conference. So I also know that not only do we work together, but there's presentations that they're jointly giving, and they do spend a lot of time together. And we're continuing to look to foster that. I'm happy to go back through some of Ed's responses on that. But again, sometimes there are different lenses when you look at the county's flood district and water services, that we do have different lenses. And so our ability to work together allows those to transfer through, but doesn't mean also that we're always pulling the same direction or working on the same thing at the same time. So I will definitely circle back with Director Schenk on that to make sure that that's a fair assessment and follow back up if anything changes on that.
I'm just going to bring up maybe a broader question with regard to this. I'm assuming that most modeling for flood, where there's flood risk in the city was done pre-fire. And those are changed as conditions change, but it may take time, hopefully sooner. But my wonder is, they provide a worst case scenario in their report, and it was in the newspaper. And if you look at the volumes of water, what I think we need is a broad look at, the amount of water that could be coming down, how that would affect, let's say it's a 1,000-year flood or a 5,000-year flood. How that will that work with the project that's going in, on south side and downtown, and to prevent flooding in that area? Or is that going to be overwhelmed by that? And that the idea of debris is a whole different thing, and how you contain the debris, and that plugs up everything. But so I'm not saying I would think we need this immediately, but I think in the long-term city planning, and it involves, where are the flood locations? What is the flood risk? You report to FEMA. And basically, the zoning for areas that are yet to be built on. Like, for example, where the city in the next 5 to 10 to 20 years is going to build, there's going to be a 30% increase in population in the Wesley Powell, area. And I think all that land below the Rio treatment plant has been purchased by private folks. And how they develop that land, and people who buy houses or whatever on that land should be aware of the risk. And the city, if I was all powerful, I would say, well, that floodplain for the Rio should be turned into a parkway. It should never be built on. But I'm not, so you almost need like a map of the layer of the city where you can put layers on top of it and look at these 3 or 4 components and see how they all fit together to make sense of it. So I'm not saying this could take a long time to think about and do, but maybe it's planning I would suggest that might need to be thought about.
To follow on to that, I sat in a meeting this morning where I can't remember the person's name, but she was giving an update for the regional plan. And as, you know, if we're looking at the regional plan for 20 years and where you can do construction and what the growth rate should be and where you should or should not put things, that should really kind of roll up into that for the big picture going forward, right? So I'll try to, yeah, I've got the person's email. I'll go back and maybe that's something that really needs to get integrated into that in the longer term, right? Because that's a master plan. And so I would just continue to urge the water department, and I know they have been. I think it was last year, this time, we had the county in talking to us about how they were getting funding. And our big ask was, please coordinate, because it's a giant, completely intertwined system. The county properties roll into the city and the city's got to be prepared and coordinated with them to understand what's coming so our facilities can handle everything. And I think the team's been doing a good job of that. And I know that council members, Sweet has been leading that charge as well. So we just need to keep that up because we don't want to get surprised by their activities. And then all of a sudden there's a big detriment to us or our facilities and they get overwhelmed, right? It's got to work as a system. So anyway.
One last comment.
Agreed.
Go ahead.
This is Councilmember Sweet, and I was just saying I agree. Thank you.
First of all, I want to give kudos to Stormwater because I got this very nice email after the last Water Commission meeting. Everybody in our neighborhood got the same email that describes the status of the project at 180 and Schultz Creek and discusses the insurance a little bit. So I really appreciate the promptness of Stormwater's response to that. That was great. I guess it's, you know, my comments come from just common sense. When I bought a house down in Coconino Estates, I'm thinking, well, this has got to be a floodplain. So I checked on the flood insurance and there was none required. And I knew it was a bad idea, but I bought the house anyway. Sometimes other parties have influence on what you do. So, and my house was not flooded, so it's not a big deal, but I did have a river in front of my property a couple times. But it wasn't near the problems that Donny Park has had and other places, so I'm thankful for that. But I wanted to thank Stormwater because all you have done in the last 2 years is pretty amazing, if you ask me.
Thank you.
Agree. Done.
Thank you. Apologies for coming in late, but you may have already covered this topic. I'm wondering if FEMA has any plans to update flood maps for the Flagstaff region, given the way things have changed physically with the surface runoff system.
I'm with you. I think they should. I haven't heard any talks that they would do a new flood insurance study. The last one was done in 2010, off the top of my head. They've done one for Kachina in the county. I haven't heard of talks for the city though.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Oh, hold on.
Hello, Water Commission members. I just want to clarify a statement about the rate study and the detention basins for clarity. When we initially had the rate study come forward, detention basin cleanups were a part of the rates. But we did pull that out of the rates and now it's external funding. So the state funding that we got, the 8.9 million last year was supposed to set aside about 4 million toward future detention basin cleanups. And then if there's any other major cleanups, that was intended that we'd have grants or something for external cleanouts. So we don't have the rates covering those at this time. So I just want to make that clear that it's not in the rates.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
You bet.
All right, well, thank you. Oh, one more. Okay, last call.
Okay, thank you. I guess this is a question for Director Jones then. Based on the positive report we've heard here about the detention basins and so forth, on the current red, yellow, green schedule, we show as yellow the detention pond cleanouts and the Arroyo Seco projects, Spruce Wash. Do you consider those still yellow or have those moved to a green status?
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Vane, so for me, and maybe a little bit subjective on the red, green, yellow, that one still says yellow and on my listing specifically because two things. Until all the work is complete, there's still an opportunity for sediment to begin to migrate. And so until all of those things are in place, it stays on my radar. And then as Director Tatter kind of mentioned too, there's still some funding strategy where I don't think we really have a complete appreciation for building a basement and what is the level of effort that's going to be required to do that? I mean, staff is doing good today, making sure those things are clean and they're ready. But so it stays on my radar in the event that those fill up. How fast can I mobilize and how fast can I do that? And I think until we've experienced that a few times, then I still lack a little bit of confidence of understanding what's the magnitude of resources and funding in order to do that. It also isn't completely funded to the rates, right? So I don't have, so as I begin to determine what the actual amount of funding required to systematically maintain those and that is solidified. So again, it doesn't move to the red, but it, and the yellow kind of being that it's still on my radar that are there a few moving pieces and so that's why I kind of listed it that way. But again, it is a little bit subjective and if there's further discussion or just showing like maybe if there's a disagreement on where that would go, but that's why I kind of listed it as yellow.
Yeah, so I gather it's future risk you're worried about, rightfully so. But as far as construction is of what's planned today, is that, I gathered from the presentation that that's pretty much on track.
Yeah, stuff is on track. The preparedness is good. I also feel it's a little bit interesting with sedimentation basins because when they're empty, then they're green. But one event, right, could change that. And if I have multiple back-to-back events, so again, maybe I'm a little overly cautious, but I think that's a good place for me to be currently. And so again, that's why I kind of downgraded to the yellow and I keep it as an awareness for me and for the commission or whoever reviews that report. But I think that's a great question.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I think we've talked about some of the considerations in those boxes is where are we on planning, where are we on funding, and where are we on execution? So you're sort of always in a planning phase for those because of it could be totally green come December, but come June, things could break quick and it could go from green to red in a day, right? So, or that's too fast, but yeah, but I think yellow is appropriate. So thank you, Director Jones.
Just relating to this, something a little bit nice. If you haven't taken a walk up Schultz Creek from the Y, now is a really good time to do it because those little structures, the Forest Service, I'm not sure if it's the Forest Service or the county that built them, above the 3 retention basins are now running and have water, and there's like a series of ponds that kind of look like beaver ponds or something up there. So it's kind of cool. So.
Thanks, John. Okay. Thank you very much. And thanks for stepping in. Yeah. We'll move to old business, item 5A, rate study update from Aaron Young. Perpetual update
You plugging stuff?
for a while.
Is that?
Good evening, Commissioners. Erin Young, Water Resources Manager, and I'm just here to introduce Carol. You've seen her many times before. We have an abbreviated presentation that was provided to Council on Tuesday night. They did adopt the notice of intention to increase or change water, sewer, reclaimed water rates. Carol's second slide actually includes the outcome of the meeting, which was a request to have a special work session where council can review kind of the modeling assumptions and we can have a live modeling session with them to check the sensitivity to making changes on those parameters. So with that, we'll go through the abbreviated presentation and go from there. Any questions before we get going? Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Let's go. Thank you, Carol.
Thank you, Erin, and good evening. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So, Mr. Chair and Water Commission members, it's great to see you again. As Erin mentioned, I was just there Tuesday night and talked with City Council about the whole rate study. So we are going over all the components. I'm going to spare you some of the slides we went over, but I still have quite a few slides. The majority of these slides you've seen before, but there is some new information. So I'm going to go through these slides fairly quickly, except for the newer slides. So please stop me if you have questions. Today, as I mentioned, we're pulling together the entire rate study and all of the steps, all of those tasks that we completed. We'll start with the financial plans. If you recall, that was from back in the fall, in October. We'll go over capacity fees, miscellaneous fees, and miscellaneous fees is a new topic that you haven't seen information for, so we'll go over that. And then we'll finish with the cost of service rates and the whole the whole directed rate structures. Now, it's important to keep in mind that while City Council adopted that notice of intention to increase rates, Council did not comment on the rates themselves. They still have the option to change these and change the assumptions that go into the rates. So these are the rates that we'll talk about today at the end of this presentation are what you've seen before and where we stand right now. We'll also follow up with the next steps. A new slide that you haven't seen before is another way to look at all of the sources of revenues that Water Services has available to fund the needs that Water Services has. These sources of funds balance out the uses of funds. And we're going to walk through these in the presentation. The largest component are those monthly user charges from rates. That makes up about 84% of the total revenues each year. Next, we'll talk about capacity fees. Capacity fees are those fees for brand new connections or connections who are upsizing their meter or their capacity. That makes up about 6% of total revenues to fund Water Services needs. Other fees are what I was calling miscellaneous fees. So these fees make up about 7% of the total revenues. These include items such as permit fees, meter installation fees, and other surcharges that I'll go over when we get to that section. And then finally, we call the last bit of use or sources of funds non-rate revenues. These are things like interest income and other types of sources of funds that the Water Services may obtain to help fund services. All of these fees or all of these revenue sources can be modified by external funding. So if Water Services receives grants or loans, that helps moderate the amount of revenue that is needed from these other sources. I'm going to maintain this theme through the rest of the presentation. We're going to start out with the financial planning task, and this is the baseline for how we calculate monthly user charges. Way back when we started this study, believe it or not, we started 10 months ago, and we started looking at assumptions such as growth in accounts. We were assuming 1% annually for the water and wastewater systems and 0% for the reclaimed water systems. We were looking at reserve targets, so making sure that the water fund, the reclaimed water fund, and the wastewater fund, each as independent enterprise funds, that they maintain a certain amount of balance within those funds to meet 90 days of operations and maintenance expenses. There are other assumptions that go into this financial plan. I'm not going to go through them all, but you might recall that there are some assumptions that we had to make to forecast what the needs of Water Services were in each fund each year, not only for the next 5 years, but also for the next 10. We will come back to talking about some of the major future projects that impact portions of this study, such as water supply security projects and wastewater treatment plant expansions. I'm going to start with the water fund. Excuse me. So again, we're talking about financial planning. And this is a new slide. You haven't seen this before. This slide demonstrates how we are projecting what the water fund operating expenses and debt service. So each of the bars in this stacked bar chart represents a certain category of expenses. You can see that the fiscal year 2024 expenses, so the year we are in right now, is the lowest out of the bars, because starting in the next fiscal year, so starting in July for fiscal year 2025, we're assuming that the water service is going to fully fund their operations and maintenance needs. Unlike in the past where water services had to make do with the revenues that were received. So now we're looking at what is needed. What is the base operating budget that is required to run the system? We also have like I said, the debt service included in here. So annual debt service is projected to increase over time. So once we have that initial adjustment in fiscal year 2025, then we've got a little bit of leveling out because of one-time expenses that go away after fiscal year 25, but we have a pretty normal escalation over the next 10 years or 9 years, excuse me. The next important input into the financial planning task is the capital improvement program projects. So the CIP project list for all of the project items we've included in this study are here on these lists. So you want to read that through really quickly. Actually, we'll make sure you have a copy of this, and you've seen some of this before, but there's no timing that we're putting on this chart, but we do take timing and scheduling of these projects into account. We also take into account the asterisk projects, so those projects that are intended to be funded entirely or partially with grants. So that's an important source of funds here. You'll notice that out of the total 10-year CIP, 182.2 million, we don't have the large future water supply security projects. Those will come into play in the capacity fee discussion. However, this dollar amount is in today's dollars. When we apply escalation for future dollars, we see that the total capital improvement program is roughly 214.6 million. The chart here, this is a new chart that you haven't seen. This chart takes these annual expenditures and breaks them out into the funding source that we're projecting when we did this study. Now, over time, this will change. Perhaps you'll get more loans or more grants. But for the most part, these were the assumptions we used when developing the financial forecast for the water fund. As I mentioned, these are escalated dollars. So the largest source is the blue bars, and that is a combination of annual revenue from rates, as well as using the rates and fees that have been built up in the fund balance. So we're drawing down the fund balance as well, particularly in the first few years. And you can tell because of the mix of funds that are needed. There is a plan for future debt, and management services, in particular the finance folks, have always planned for future borrowing. So we're using their assumptions plus some assumptions here on future borrowing for to add to the mix of how to execute this full CIP plan. It ends up being about on average $20 million a year for the water fund through 2033. You've seen this slide before, and I'm going to describe it in a little more detail today. There were numerous options of how the water fund could adjust rates in order to accomplish different objectives. So whether it is funding just enough of the CIP to keep up with inflation, or to adjust for inflation and in the rates and be able to fund a little bit more. So the approved CIP that has been in the 5-year balance plan, plus some additional projects, such as some projects that were informed by your water infrastructure master plans. And then we have this alternative option that was developed back in October, excuse me, where we looked at fully funding all of the capital improvement program projects over the next 10 years that had been sitting in the wings, waiting to be funded. All the projects that were in the approved CIP, the informed CIP, plus some unfunded projects. So given that plan, that 214.6 million of escalated costs and all of the operations and maintenance expenses that I showed you, rate adjustments of 15% per year for the next 5 years were calculated. Another thing to note, that even though we were directed to go forward with this plan, a 15% rate increase across the board, once you run it through that cost of service process, and you might remember we talked about this, when you look at it from a cost of service perspective and a proportionality perspective, and you bring customer classes into account, not every customer class or not every customer will see a 15% increase in their water bill. It may be more, it may be less, and that's what we'll cover when we talk about the rates. That's the water fund. And I have a set of these slides for each of the other funds. Next is wastewater. Wastewater it's a little similar, but we have some differences here. We have more debt service for the wastewater fund, and with over the next 4 or 5 years, we have a projection that increases. But what changes by fiscal year 2029 are the operating capital projects. So these are annual maintenance, repairs of equipment that are only forecasted to be at a certain level through 2028. That may change, but this is why you see the escalation here in expenses and then a drop off in 2029, and then it continues escalating at an average rate of inflation. But I just wanted to mention why there's that drop off is because for the next 5 years, we're just looking at a specified 5-year plan for operating capital. The wastewater CIP list is shorter than the water fund list. However, there are some significant projects included in this list. What is not included are 2 main categories. One is this note at the bottom. There are projects that were funded through a general obligation bond with the city, and those bonds are being repaid with property tax revenues. So those projects are not included on this list, and that's not included in the rate calculation. Another project that's not included in this list is that the wastewater treatment plant future expansion, that is included in the capacity fee study. But the 116 million of today's dollars in wastewater CIP costs that you see here are what we used when moving forward with the financial plan. Just as in the water fund, we escalate those capital improvement projects. The total is estimated at 144.1 million through 2033. And you'll notice that we're fairly certain about the mix of funding in the near term, but then as we go forward, we still are looking to fund some projects perhaps with debt, with future loans. No grants are forecasted at this point, but that all can change. And I know that Management Services right now is looking at all of these funding sources as well. When we started this rate study, this is the mix of funding that we are looking at. So again, the majority of the revenues for the cash funding the capital projects is from rates. I need to make another comment too, is that even though we are borrowing money for a significant portion of this capital plan, those borrowed funds have to be paid back. That is also through rates. So ultimately, that comes back into the revenue requirements each year. Similar to water, we have this wastewater projected plan to fully fund all the CIP projects that we talked about. This plan looks at 2 years of 25% rate adjustments, followed by 15% in 2027, then 10, then 5. So that initial bump is needed to pay for the current level of projects that are in the near term. And again, just like in water, once we run this through the cost of service analysis and the rate analysis, a customer may not just see a 25% increase in their bill. It could be less, it could be more. Last one is the Reclaimed Water Fund. Reclaimed Water is mirroring the other two funds. And in fact, that first year adjustment projected for fiscal year 2025 is to get the expenditures up to that base operating budget. And then it goes down a little bit and then proceeds forward just like the other two funds at a constant rate of inflation. There is no debt currently for the Reclaimed Water Fund. The Reclaimed Water CIP list is shown here. The full list with all of the projects that were in the approved CIP for the 5-year CIP, plus the informed CIP from the master planning process and the unfunded projects is a total of almost 57 million in today's dollars. We know that the actual execution of these projects is limited, and it's limited because of the policy of setting reclaimed water rates as a percentage of potable water rates. I know we've had that discussion in the past, but that limits the amount of projects that can be completed. And in fact, given the potable water recommendations and direction, the reclaimed water direction and rate adjustments will take us to about 11.3 million in projects that would be able to be funded through 2033. This is entirely through revenue collected from reclaimed water rates. That reclaimed water rate plan that was directed back in October, again, mirrors what we saw in water, 15% rate adjustments. And we've made it through financial plans. I can keep moving through capacity fees if you like. That'd be a good idea.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Okay, great. Capacity fees then are that next section of the rate study that takes a look at new connections and growth-related expenses. I'm going to cut to the chase and tell you, and you already know this, based on your review and your recommendations and council's review and council's recommendations, direction on capacity fees are the following items. We are applying the combined methodology for water and wastewater capacity fees when we're calculating these fees. If you recall, there are 3 typical methodologies that the American Water Works Association and Water Environment Federation promotes. The combined methodology is that third method that takes into account historical investments in infrastructure that new customers can benefit from, plus forward-looking investments in your infrastructure that are growth or expansion related. So these, the combined method takes into account both of these types of infrastructure. Next, when we're looking at a unit of capacity or a equivalent residential unit and the level of service that they require, we are using the system, the actual system usage values. So this means that the average and the peak gallons per capita per day are brought into account when we're looking at what one new equivalent residential unit needs in terms of capacity when they hook up to your system. The next direction was to begin, well, first of all, calculate capacity fees, and then start collecting capacity fees to help fund the future water supply projects. These may be any sort of future water security projects, not necessarily one particular project, but when we include an estimated cost for these types of projects in our capacity fees, the fees are a little bit higher. And then the recommendation is that the Water Services sets aside an amount to help fund those projects in the future. The same is true on the wastewater side. So the direction was to collect capacity fees to start bolstering up the funding sources for a new wastewater treatment facility. And then finally, we were looking at levels of service for wastewater that included not only a flow or hydraulic component, but also a loadings or a strength of wastewater flow component. This multi-based level of service is important because your future wastewater projects are more geared towards increasing the capacity of treating solids at your treatment plant. So incorporating that strength of flow element is important when going forward and determining how new customers might impact your system. Pulling all of these points together, we've calculated the fees, and you've seen these slides before, but I'm going to start with water. The set of water projects that include a growth component is listed on this chart. So we have 70.5 million of the 10-year CIP projects that include growth. However, we've also added in an estimate of $230 million for future water supply projects. Pulling those pieces of information into the calculation of the capacity fees and going through all the other options, we have the recommended or the directed option that we called 1B, the future water supply and new groundwater capacity option. This option, we just happen to name it that, but this option looked at, again, using actual system data for level of service, and it included that additional cost for future water supply projects. It resulted in a capacity fee for a 3/4 inch residential type connection, or ERU, equivalent residential unit, of $8,146. That fee then is scaled based on water meter size. As an example, we show a 2-inch commercial meter. It could be a 2-inch landscape meter. It could be any kind of customer, but it's the meter size that's important here. And that would be an increase for that customer of about $13,000, or that new customer. The schedule of those capacity fees by water meter size is shown here under this proposed B column. There's your $8,146. And each of these fees is scaled based on this assumption that an equivalent residential unit and the cost of the capacity to serve that unit is a little over $8,000. It's currently $5,728. For your information, we just kept presenting the existing number of accounts that are by meter size. So you could see the 3/4 inch meter is by far the largest category of customers. And then here's an average use per meter size per month if you're interested in really how much water on a monthly average do customers with those meter sizes use. So that's the water capacity fee. We're going to look at the same thing for the wastewater. Wastewater capacity fee is made up of the growth-related projects on this list. So it's about $38.3 million of projects that are in the CIP, plus an estimated $245 million for the wastewater treatment plant expenses. Just as in water, although we presented twice as many options for the wastewater capacity fee, the orange highlight shows us the directed option is 1D, which is the wastewater capacity fee developed with a level of service that includes actual use data plus the loadings data or the concentration, and then it includes the wastewater treatment plant expansion costs. You might be surprised that the actual change in the fee is not as significant as in water, and that is primarily because the amount of growth-related capital improvements in the CIP is much less than on the water side. It's about half. So you have a smaller impact here. So for a 3/4 residential water meter, we have a little over $4,000 for the proposed fee, and then you'll see that the 2-inch meter is also higher. The schedule for the wastewater capacity fee is on this chart. Again, it's based on water meter size, and the equivalencies are based on your 3/4 inch residential meter. We have a few notes on this slide. The first note is that when you get into those larger meter sizes, you're going to find more variety in the type of customer that is requiring that larger meter, so you get a new industry. And we recommend that you actually customize the fee, calculate the fee based on the unit cost developed in the study for those large customers, because the loadings will be different of some of these larger users, and the flows will definitely be different for the larger users. So we just and you have that anyway right now for some of your in your current schedule for capacity fees, the city does. So it just says, call for the estimated fee. The second point is that multifamily connections in your current schedule of capacity fees for wastewater are interesting, because you'll see that it's just the one fee. It's just $37.23. But the note is that that is a unit cost per development unit. So that's not the right term. If you have an apartment complex and you have 15 apartments, individual dwelling units in that connection, it's more, the fee is charged on the 15 dwelling units rather than the meter size. And so we're proposing that you continue that practice. That is a pretty typical practice. So we propose that you continue that in your capacity fee schedule. That's it for capacity fees.
Carol, can I ask a quick question? As to the capacity fees collected in driving towards that 230 million for the new plant, when is that estimated to be done? Is it a 10-year period that generates that 230 million? I'm trying to think, or am I thinking about this wrong?
Mr. Chair, this is just the beginning. So the fees are not calculated to recover the total, say 245 million within the certain period of time. It is just a portion of that fee. And we also recommend that when you have a better idea of the actual cost of the project, or if other costs change or if growth changes, that these fees be recalculated. So the small amount that you see that is a portion for the future treatment plant or water supply, we propose you put in a separate account so that it just grows until the point where you have we have a better idea of the costs of the other funding sources and the timing of the projects.
Commissioner Vane.
This is in essence a follow-up on that same question. When you do the calculation to decide the size of those capacity fees, do you have some guideline that you used to say what percentage of those future costs that you're trying to collect through the capacity fees? In other words, you used the example of 245 million. Are you estimating that the capacity fees over time will be, 5% of that, 10% of that, half of that? What's your goal? How do you arrive at the capacity fee?
So, Mr. Chair and Commissioner Vane, we do have an assumption here, but it is based on capacity. So if the treatment plant contributes, it does. We do have that slide here. Let me go back if you don't mind. It increases capacity at 9 million gallons per day. So we actually calculate a unit cost in gallons per day. And we say one equivalent residential unit on the wastewater side requires, I think it's just around 300 gallons per day. So that 9 million gallons per day can serve a lot of equivalent residential units. We do the math. It's actually very simple math. And we take the 9 million gallons per day and the 245 million and determine what that dollar is. I can't do that math in my head, but it's probably pretty easy. And then we add that and say every equivalent residential unit that is added to the system just picks up their cost of that capacity.
Got it. I understand. Thank you.
Okay, good. Thanks. Any other questions on this?
I just, what I wanted to avoid was the perception that when we get to the end of this rate study period, there's $240 million sitting somewhere to fund all this, because it could be interpreted that way, and then it'll be a shocker for those in the community that didn't quite understand that. So that's why I'm asking.
Mr. Chair, thanks for that observation. We will make sure, we don't have that in our report right now, but I think we need to make that clear. Because if you got all of your units, all your equivalent residential units that would use up the 9 million gallons per day, the calculation should result in 245 million, but that doesn't happen. You know, growth happens over time. You have to build the project before growth all shows up. So it is just a unit cost of capacity. We'll make sure we mention that in the report.
What are the guidelines for determining what meter size a business or entity has to use? Is it the rate of volume that's coming into that structure or business? Or is it the overall use per day averaged, or is it averaged out over the year? You know, what are the guidelines? Can somebody tell you, hey, I want a 2-inch meter?
Mr. Chair and Commissioner Nauman, I defer to Director Jones because I don't deal in sizing water meter sizes.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, Commissioner Nauman, they could say that, but it doesn't work that way. What's taken into consideration is looking at the peaking. What's the peaking demand? We want to make sure the meter size is peaking. So as they go through the development review and they work with our design engineers, they're determining that meter size based on, I think there's a few things that they would look at specifically. And I'm happy to follow up with the exact, but I think typically things like square footage, outdoor watering, is it a landscaping meter? But it is, so it's not as simple as just determining what meter size you want. Like, you have to provide those, what are the estimated flows, right, that's gonna be used, and they'll determine that size.
Say someone designs a building that uses water at a constant rate slowly and then has a storage area in the building itself. So they never exceed a certain capacity, but they could use more water than that meter, you know. So they decrease their maximum rate that they need at any one moment. Does that make sense?
I don't think I'm tracking exactly with you, that they store water to meet their peaking need.
Well, say you had a really incredibly designed apartment complex that everything was refined to the low flow maximum, and you know, I can see a little bit of unfairness is metering each unit separately in the when they're actually using, say, a 2-inch meter or whatever. But I could see you could design a way around, you could engineer a way around to use a smaller meter. And if the engineer says, hey, we can do it with this size meter, you would accept that.
I think that would be an answer to the conversation. I feel like typically the conversation will be the other way of why you were trying to convince me you need a larger meter, not a smaller meter. I think because of that, because of the capacity for that, the meter. But I think even going back, it reflects in there again, I think where you're trying to go is like into the world of like, well, this is what we're actually gonna use. But on the design standards, it helps with the design standard. And that's why there was a conversation, do we use the design standard for determining capacity fees, or do we use the actual? And when you go back to that table, you can see using the design standards really drives that number up, because the design number is, I think for wastewater, it was like, again, like the 360 gallons, right, per day, when the actual is less, but you still have to build to the design standards. And so for your meter placement would still be for that design. And so I think to also kind of point that, I think just to further along what Carol was saying about the capacity and the wastewater expansion, you can also see on the chart. So even if we were to use actual flows and the loading, so option C and D, right? The first option was that we did not include that expansion. and what the calculated fee would be. And by using option D and the wastewater expansion included, that delta, I think, is like around $200 difference in the capacity. So when you looking at a 200, right, 240, $250 million project, the difference in there is about $200, I think per equivalent residential unit, is the difference. And so again, to her point, where it's not looking to recoup all of that, and we knew that at the time, and even through the conversation, we know capacity fees, again, are currently about 6% of the revenues coming in. We know that there's other opportunities for funding, grant funding, maybe cooperative partnerships, all those things that'll be looked at. But I think what we're identifying is we knew, even though it wasn't currently programmed in the 10-year forecast, that it is coming in. The sooner that we get started beginning to carving out some revenue, setting aside, that puts us in a better position of waiting till that hits the plan. That impact would be different. So getting ahead of that allows that compounding effect. But it doesn't look to recoup the whole amount because we know that there'll be other funding strategies. And as Carol's point, we haven't really even determined what's the size, what's the type of treatment, what is the cost. But we knew it was going to be something, and getting that earlier start. So again, I think it made sense to add it in, but the intent wasn't that you would have all that money by the time you built your wastewater treatment plant. So, thank you.
I mean, we've had several discussions in different areas about signaling, right? And this is signaling we've got something coming down the line that's bigger than a bread box. So, yeah. Thank you.
Any other questions on capacity fees? I'm going to move on then to miscellaneous fees, and this is a new section for us to discuss. Miscellaneous fees are those charges, as I mentioned, that are the water services and customer service still performs activities that cause that take time and cause costs, but they are charged in specific fees and specific charges so that the revenues from rates don't have to support these services. The miscellaneous fee calculation process is pretty straightforward. We actually met and had many conversations with water services and customer services staff to talk about those items that would be recovered through these miscellaneous fees. And in fact, there's several sections in the city's code that outline these fees. So we wanted to look at which fees require which staff members to do what types of activities and how long, so we could build up the costs for these activities. We also added any equipment or, such as a truck and other types of expenses, such as materials. Maybe water meters was a good example, where you could actually take the identified costs of service and build up the fee from there. We have a model for these types of calculations, and we also have experience with other utilities that charge similar fees that we had to look at and say, okay, well, what's a typical approach for late fees? So how can we compare what's being done, and do we need any data to use for these fees? And then we finally look at the implications of the calculations, because sometimes 100% cost recovery is not necessarily a policy that is followed. So, and there are good reasons for that, and we'll go over a couple examples. This is a very easy formula for calculating the cost of service of these miscellaneous fees. So it's hours for specific staff times the labor plus any kinds of materials and equipment, and then we get that total cost of service. So very straightforward, but involves a lot of discussion and consideration. The first area that we'd like to talk about are the water meter installations. So in addition to that capacity fee that a new connection pays, they also have to buy their meter and get it installed. So the city's distribution team does these installations, and I believe that the fees have not been changed since 2010, if I'm not mistaken. The water meters are installed and hooked up, by their meter sizes, of course. We've already talked about meter sizes. The 3/4 inches is the typical residential size, and the current fee is $210. When we actually factor in the current cost for this type of meter and the labor and all the equipment needed to install the meter, it's actually $806. So that change, that increase would be just shy of $600 for a 3/4 inch meter for today. For a 1-inch meter, the costs are fairly close, and the increase in costs from what you charge today is fairly close to that 3/4 inch meter. That's then where you kind of go off and diverge from the 3/4 inch and 1 inch, because the larger the meter size, the more costly and the more it takes to install these meters. So 1.5 inch meter, even though the current fee and the proposed fee are, I mean, I wouldn't call it that significant of a difference. It's still almost $1,500 to purchase and install a 1.5 inch meter. Anything above 2 inches is identified in your code as at cost. So those are the meter installation recommendations. The next set of charges are charges from customer service. And these fees not only are recommended to be slightly adjusted, but the names of these fees are also proposed to change. If you look to your code today, you'd see that this first item is actually called a new service turn on fee or turn off fee. And this is essentially the establishment of a water service connection. And that costs money. Customer services has to set up the account in the system. It has to actually start up the service. And when that service is requested and it's accomplished the next business day, the cost is proposed to be $45. That's a $21 increase from the $24 that's been charged for quite a few years. So that $45 is based on what the activities and the costs are to perform this service. If a customer has a request to turn on their service the same day, that is a higher charge, and we're proposing that it be listed as a surcharge. In talking with customer service, it would still be a water establishment fee, but because staff need to go out immediately or within that same day, it's a $20 surcharge. So the total fee that a customer would pay for that type of service is $65. And that doesn't look like it's changed from the current fee, but the rationale and the way it is, we propose it to be shown in code is different. A collection rate or a non-payment rate is an interesting example as well. This fee is proposed to be $45 up from $24. However, the actual fee for this service is more like $78. But the concept is this: if you are approaching a customer who hasn't been able to pay their bill, say they can't afford it, or they've had some payment issues, or they've had some issues, or they're at collection, they're getting sent to collections, adding on another fee only exacerbates the problem. So by policy, you might want to charge a little bit less. So in discussions with the customer service group, we said, let's recover 65% of the full cost of service so that we could still encourage customers to pay to get reconnected and continue paying their bills. The remaining service charges on this list, so meter testing, backflow prevention, backflow compliance, those are all proposed to be at the same level. So in discussions with staff, no change was recommended here. The same with malicious damage. So this is really something we don't want people to be meddling with their meters or damaging their meters, but we feel that the team felt that $150 per incident was appropriate. The next set of fees focus on the sewer part of the equation, so the wastewater fund, and particularly the pretreatment program. You have a set of industries who are part of the industrial pretreatment program, and they get special services, like they get monitored and tested and sampled for the concentrations of their waste to make sure that they're not discharging more than what they are permitted to. So a 5-year permit fee is currently charged for these industries. I think there's six or 7 of them in the city. And the current fee for a 5-year period is $1,250. This is another instance where when we actually calculated with help from the pretreatment group, when all of the costs were actually identified, that cost was a great deal higher than what these customers are currently paying. So we're proposing an increase that is equal to the inflationary costs from when this $1,250 was in place to today. I think it's a 5-year period. And that proposed fee is $1,950. And we recommend that you continue to look at this fee to adjust it over time. The next set of fees are called scavenger waste. So these are wastes that are brought to your wastewater treatment facility for treatment, so brought directly to the facility. And you have septage wastes or septic haulers. You have restaurant grease and mud sumps. So each of these fees is on a rate or $1 per 100 gallons of discharge. The septic haulers currently pay $8 per 100 gallons of discharge. We're proposing, based on the cost, that is brought up to $11. No change was proposed for restaurant grease. So because of the costs, we took a look at the cost that the pretreatment group brought in, and that change is not warranted at this time. However, making these two charges, septic waste and restaurant grease, equal to the same is helpful to staff at the treatment facility, because sometimes customers don't tell you what they bring in, whether it's septic waste or restaurant grease. So having the same fee is helpful. And then finally, the mud sump waste, that is proposed to increase by $6. There also is an after hours fee. So if a hauler comes in after normal working hours, a staff person needs to be called in out of their beds. So that is an extra charge for overtime and other costs. So we're proposing that increase by $111 to $146 per incident. And then these haulers also pay a permit fee, and that is proposed to go up to $45. Those are the wastewater related fees. There's one more set for wastewater, and they're called sewer surcharge rates. We've talked a lot about concentration and strengths of wastewater flow, and the two primary constituents are BOD, or biochemical oxygen demand, and TSS, or total suspended solids. Those are the measures of the strength of the wastewater flow. And typical domestic strength is listed as about 300 milligrams per liter for BOD and 350 milligrams per liter for TSS. Those industrial users that have permits that limit their discharge, if they discharge more than these domestic or typical residential strengths, they get charged a surcharge for those flows and those pounds. They're actually pounds of flow that we can measure. The current fees are listed here, and we're proposing that each of these fees be increased by about 15 cents per pound. So you'll see the increase for BOD and the increase in TSS. This comes directly out of the cost of service study and the average cost per pound that we calculated in the wastewater cost of service analysis. Further in the code are higher surcharge rates, and these are medium and very high strength wastes according to the concentrations of waste or milligrams per liter. And the fees in the code show that a double surcharge is applied or a triple surcharge is applied for high and very high strength waste. We propose that these types of surcharges get eliminated and stricken from your code, and that all high strength waste, so any waste over these parameters, is charged at the same surcharge per pound. And this is because this is an unusual practice. It used to be done years ago, but in terms of treatment of loadings, the treatment cost is pretty much the same for, and I know that I'm not a wastewater engineer, so someone could disagree with me, but I think that the cost for very high strength typically are not any greater than for high strength waste. So we're proposing that it's the same surcharge for all high strength waste. This is all new material. If you have any questions, sorry, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Kurt. Yeah, a quick question concerning the sewer surcharge rates. I was under the impression that the strength of waste was accounted for in the various categories of service, commercial, industrial, and so on. Under what circumstances are these surcharges actually triggered? Is somebody from water services going out and measuring it and finding that they're above what's the normal allotment, or what is the mechanism by which these would ever be implemented?
So, Mr. Chair and Commissioner Vane, that you are right that the current and proposed categories of different user rates is based on strength of flow. However, there are certain customers, if they exceed that strength of flow, and they are sampled. So if there are these typically industries that discharge higher strength waste than what they are allowed to discharge, then they get charged the surcharge. And I'll let you know right now that there is one user who pays surcharges at this level in the city.
Thank you.
I've got a question. What's the percentage of solid waste in, say, single-family residential from, grinding up, your kitchen waste in the garbage disposal? And do we have a handle on that?
So, Mr. Chair, and I think that was Commissioner Nauman. I do not know that answer. Maybe someone from Water Services knows.
Chairman, Commissioner Nauman, not at that level of grinding it up. I think you normalize it where what you would call residential waste has an expected BOD level, and that's probably closer to I would say probably 2 to maybe 250 is what you would consider like the normal strength of a sanitary wastewater. So by the time you move into the industrial and elevating that above the 300. And I feel like we've even seen some slides on that as well. When we added the loadings, we did assume a normal pounds per day loading, and that could be walked back to milligrams per liter. So that I know that rationale is applied in there.
This is just kind of a wild idea, but I know you, like the city, will give away free composting. I mean, the big containers that you can go and throw all your garden waste, yard waste. I throw all my garbage, I rarely throw anything down the garbage disposal. I was just wondering if there would be a way to give people who did compost, because it reduces the load on the treatment plant, a lower rate or a credit or something.
So I think just because of the position I'm in, I think there's a couple challenges. One, how you track that on account. The other one is, again, going back to I live in the design world, right? So today you telling me that you're not going to put it down the garbage disposal, I give you a credit, but my cost and level of service doesn't change because tomorrow you don't live there, somebody else does, or you change your mind, or you forget. Like, again, I live in the design world, and then I get to muddle in the actual world.
I said it was a wild idea, so
Maybe-
yeah.
Maybe the bonus is they get a free composting thing. Here's your
Get more
composting
compost,
bucket.
so
Here you go with the water department logo on it. Yeah.
It
But I
seems to disappear somehow. I'm not sure why. I know it's kind of a wild idea, but
No, thanks for allowing me to engage in that conversation.
that's all right.
But I think if, Mr. Chair, if I could, I've seen this presentation a couple times. And also, because I also live in the customer service world where I get where, as we're walking through the rates, right? This is a methodical process looking at fees, cost of service, how we delineate, it gets very granular. But even listening to us walk through the presentation where I walked through 4 points where you as a customer feel that I'm charging you for something, and I just keep adding on these hidden costs. So I think I'm just practicing, for when these conversations come up. There's a reason why we're granular. And again, I think emphasizing the point where, that Carol made, when you look at the revenues that come in, 84% of our revenue comes from that monthly service fee, that every month on your bill. Well, the reason that's not 100% is because we do get granular. Why we start breaking that down into, well, what's capacity fees? What are these other fees? But the reason we do that is because the intent is not to put the onus of that revenue requirement on the ratepayer, right? And so again, when you're signing up into the system, I know that it can feel that way, right? You pay the capacity fees, then I charge you for the meter. I charge you if I replace asphalt. If you want your water turned on, turned off, I charge you. Right, it does compound. I get where it creates that impression, but the reason we're built that way is if it wasn't, what you would see is 100% of revenue is generated from the ratepayer. And so by breaking this down, so whether it's a septic hauler bringing a load of septic waste to the wastewater treatment plant, I divert that from the ratepayer and I put it the cost of service on the person providing that service. So again, some of this is just me practicing. I feel maybe I'm on my soapbox, not trying to convince you of something. But ultimately, as we're walking through, I think there is an impression that, man, you just keep adding fee after fee. The revenue requirement doesn't change. The fees are delineating that cost to the people receiving the service intentionally to keep the onus off of just applying a rate to everybody monthly to cover the revenue. Anyway, so I'll stop there, but thought I'd give it a shot trying to verbalize that.
So just to follow up on that, I mean, think, and Commissioner Dilday has said this many times about we need to be in a position to explain and essentially sell this increase. And I think we are gonna have to come up with a package, if you will, which is, here's the guiding principles of how we operate this system. And one of the guiding principles is we try to put the charges to the folks and companies that are actually using these things. So it's not what you just said. I think we're gonna have to let people know these rates haven't been touched since 2010. You know, or when was the last time that whole rate group was touched? Because they're gonna look at this and go, it feels like yesterday my bill went up. Well, no, actually for that, it was 14 years ago, you know, so we're gonna have to be able to market this and explain what's happening in a way that people can process it better than just the shock and awe of every piece of my bill is increasing. Now, that is a fact for most people, but why and how does it relate and how does the system relatively work? And I think we've had several discussions on that, and that's been a big concern about how do we have the community come along with us in a more educated and supportive manner than pitchforks and you know, and fire down the hallway. So I think it's gonna be important that we have that conversation and put that together.
Yeah, one of those numbers I was curious about, if we look at the capacity fees and the installation fees and everything, how much does the average price of a single family home increase as the result of this? Do we have that number? And again, I'm just curious about it. Somebody certainly Chamber of Commerce must ask this question.
So you can go to a website and do your own bill and actually update and see, right? There's a tool.
Oh, with capacity fees for the meter and installation though, I can do
But
that.
no, your home, but go
Oh, I
ahead.
don't mean rates. I mean,
Ah.
I mean the builder, when they put in the 3/4 inch meter and all that. How much more does it cost?
So it is something that we can look at. I don't, but again, I don't think you can apply a number. So also the reason the fees are broke down is some of these are case by case basis. If the water main is on the east side of the street and you're building a house on the west side of the street, it will cost you more than the person that built, just because that line is 60 foot longer, right? That's another 60 foot of copper, another 60 foot of trench. Your square footage, right? 3 foot by 6, like, so again, recovering those costs. Again, it seems like we're being granular and petty, but it takes the burden off of recovering that through your monthly volume, right? So it is kind of case by case basis, but when you look at those fees to install, it's kind of gets that dynamic. What's the meter size and
Well, I would say just a typical installation. I mean, the capacity fees are bigger than the cost of the installation of the meters anyway, I believe.
Mhm.
But a 3/4 inch meter, standard single family home, how much more is it gonna cost them? Just curious.
Right, so I do believe the information is there and I can definitely add those up and give you a typical.
Mhm. We could calculate that.
It just might be a number to have for the public, or somebody's gonna ask that question. How much does it affect my new price in my single family home?
A great question.
I had the same question too, so second that. Say if a big developer comes in, they build a subdivision, and is the city always responsible for building the water infrastructure for that subdivision, or is sometimes the contractor do it himself? How does that work?
So, Mr. Chair, Council Norman, obviously typically how that will work is the developer will install the infrastructure to city standards and codes. They get inspected. And upon acceptance, that would get turned over to the city to operate and maintain. But that the developer would put that infrastructure in.
There are still certain parts of the capacity that added capacity would be covered somehow. They won't have the meter installation and a lot of these fees associated with it, but how would the capacity increase of that subdivision over the long term be handled?
And I think that's a good question. I would think at the time you determine the meter size, because that's what would drive the capacity. And so whether the developer is asking to install the meter and you buy that turnkey, or that's parsed out and maybe other developers are buying us, but I think it would be at the time that they requested the meter service that the capacity for that portion would be. The analysis, like your water sewer impact analysis, is being done to determine, do we have capacity to provide that? But I think the actual fee would be closer to the time of either permit or meter install.
I was just thinking about, if it's a really big, really impacts the system, overall system, the wastewater treatment system. It gets us up to a threshold in providing potable water. It could have a big effect, a really large increase like that, so.
Yeah. Go ahead.
It's also, well, it's common in a development agreement. If the developer reaches the threshold that is beyond what we're calculating in capacity fees in those projects, then I don't know if you mentioned this, but a development agreement might require an upfront commitment from the developer to fund like whatever water sewer infrastructure is needed. And then if there's additional capacity, they can sell that capacity, sell it through recapturing type agreements. And so those are in our city code and those are somewhat common with the bigger developers. It's just another tool that I thought I'd share.
And Mr. Chair, if I may, in terms of when we calculate the capacity fees that you see here, we exclude any developer contributed infrastructure. So since that's contributed and not paid and not essentially backbone infrastructure that results in capacity, we're looking at larger conveyance, larger transmission mains and treatment plants and pumps and et cetera. So we do those locally contributed assets are not included in this calculation.
Thank you.
Any other questions on these miscellaneous fees? If not, we'll go on to the last and largest component of the rate study, and this should be the freshest in your mind, I hope. These are the cost of service rates. If you remember, we went through that process of determining what were the priorities of the setting rates, and the leading priorities were revenue stability, conservation and demand management, administration or administrative burden, and proportionality between and within classes. We were calling that equity, but we've renamed that to proportionality, and then affordability. We use these priorities to present to you and to City Council a series of of different rate designs and rate structures for water and wastewater. And tonight I'll just talk about the selected or preferred alternatives. I have one set of new slides that I'd like to talk to you about, but I'll start with the water rates. We had 3 different options with a revised option for the water rate structure. The selected or preferred option was we're just calling it option 3 revised. And that option has a combination of the fixed monthly meter charges and the volume charges with some adjustments from your current water rate structure today. So the monthly fixed meter charges today, so those are the charges by water meter size that every account pays every month, regardless of any water used. So the charges today recover about 29% of the water fund's annual revenue requirements. Remember that a minimum policy for the water fund is a 25% of the total revenues to be recovered through those fixed monthly charges. So our option 3 revised structure reduces those fixed meter charges to and meets that target of 25% cost recovery. You'll notice that there is a decrease in that 3/4 inch meter, but then it ends. And that's because even though we've reduced the amount of revenue that is recovered from those fixed monthly charges, the grand total revenue bucket has increased for fiscal year 2025. So these rates that we're showing you for 2025 not only include an adjustment for that revenue target, but also the total revenue target is bigger. In total, the fiscal year 25 cost recovery is $4.24 million for those fixed charges. The remaining revenue requirement, or $12.72 million for fiscal year 25, is recovered through the volume charges. And these are those tiered rates for single-family customers and then uniform volume rates for the remaining customers. I'm just going to quickly go over the elements of that rate structure that we had discussed a few weeks back. And that is the current rates by tier for single family accomplish certain goals, and they have certain ratios of the different unit rates to this first tier. And remember, the first tier is for usage for single family residents each month between no usage and 3,500 gallons. Tier 2 is anything greater than 3,500 gallons up to 6,200 gallons. Tier 3 is usage between 6,200 gallons and 11,500. And then the last tier is anything greater than 11,500 gallons. So each of those increments of use is charged at a higher unit rate. Our proposed rate structure of these tiers for single family residents recovers with all the other volume rates, 75% of the annual revenue requirement, but it accomplishes different goals. So we looked at the first 2 tiers of usage being targeted for indoor usage for residential customers with different, different people per household. So in this case, we set tier 2 equal to our unit rate, recovering the average cost of service for water volumetric usage. So that rate is set at a 1.0 unit, and that rate itself is $4.72 per 1,000 gallons of use. If you have a smaller household or you use less water indoors, then you would pay that tier 1 rate. So tier 1 is set to a ratio of 0.93 times the tier 2 rate. That's how we calculated the $4.39. So that's almost so it's a lower rate for lower amounts of water usage. The peaking costs for the single family water use are driven to tiers 3 and 4. And we've accomplished that with a 2 times the tier 2 rate for tier 3 and a 4.0 times the tier 2 rate for tier 4. So if you're using over 11,500 gallons, you receive the strongest price signal. The remaining customer classes are still at a uniform rate, whether the usage is 1,000 gallons or 15,000 gallons, but we proposed that commercial and schools be combined with institutional. So we have that similar usage, all, even though the quantity of usage varies, that similar peaking usage is combined into one class. So the unit rate is the same for commercial and schools and institutions. The remaining rates you'll see are increases, again, to allow the revenue collection for that fiscal year 2025 revenue, 75% of that cost recovery here. The last rate increase for water was in 2020. And so the current rates, the current monthly fixed charges in this schedule, by the way, these are only inside city rates, including inside city and outside city on the same chart. It would be a very busy graph. So we just have, or busy chart. So we just have the inside city rates here by meter size and then the current volume rates by meter size. The schedule proposed for adjusting rates starts with the rates effective on September 1st, 2024. So that's September of this year through December 31st, 2025. So this first rate adjustment would go longer than 12 months. And then the rates would be adjusted thereafter on January 1st and be in effect for the calendar year. The same schedule or the same approach is applied for the volume rates. So this would be the forecast of rates for each meter size and each type of user. When we last spoke with you, we talked about average bill impacts for specific types of customers. These are not average meter sizes. We are calling them representative meter sizes because each customer class has varying meter sizes. Single family, of course, is most commonly 3/4 inch. And the average monthly volume for a single family resident with a 3/4 inch meter is about 4,000 gallons a month. That current bill for this year, so this fiscal year, is $30.91 for a customer using 4,000 gallons. Then we are looking at bill impacts for applying the rate adjustments, the cost of service adjustments, and the differences in the customers' classes. The total bill, again, equals a water fixed charge component and a water volume charge component. The values we're showing you here don't include the water energy charge or any of the taxes or anything like that. I'll show you a slide later that combines everything. So this is strictly the water fixed charge and the water volume charge. The bill projected for this type of customer would increase by $1.13 a month, and that's about a 3.7% increase. What you'll see when we go through each of these representative customer types is that the percentage changes vary. Remember that slide when I talked about a 15% rate adjustment doesn't mean a bill will go up by 15% for everybody. In fact, none of these examples go up by 15% this first adjustment. They're lower or higher. And we do recognize that this landscape customer for this amount of usage and this meter size shows the largest increase of almost $140 a month. And that is because of the cost of service results that show that the higher usage and higher peaking of this customer type drive those rates. We can say the same thing for this manufacturing example and the institutional example. Granted, 8 inches is the largest meter size that the city serves, and this is 2 million gallons for 1 month. That's a lot of water. So that's why the bill is so large, basically, and the increase is larger. So let me just recap for the effective date of September 1, 2024, for customers using and in these profiles, we're projecting varying rates or varying percentage changes in their total monthly bill. However, going forward, so once you align your rates and your rate structure to cost of service, going forward, it's a 15% increase across the board each year projected through 2029. Or until your next rate study is done. So you have this 15% rate increase for every customer's bill in 2020, effective January 1, 2026, January 1, 2027, et cetera. You get the picture. So that's the projection under this proposed structure and these proposed rates. I've added a couple new slides, and in fact, City Council did not get to see these on Tuesday. But in order to address concern that we were omitting a discussion of non-residential tiers, I wanted to address this. And this is not a complete evaluation of these tiers. I just wanted to bring up a couple points and just give you an idea of what went behind our analysis and our actual ultimately moving on from the non-residential tiers for now. So the elements of a tiered rate structure are outlined in the American Water Works Association Manual M1. That's the principles of rates, fees, and charges for water utilities. And there's a big discussion on inclining block rates or tiered water rates. Their main point is that tiered water rates are best applied to customer classes that have homogeneous usage characteristics, meaning their usage characteristics are fairly consistent across the customers within that class and have typical peaking and typical usage patterns. When we looked at the distribution of the commercial classes usage and landscape usage, we found that it was very difficult to see the homogeneous patterns that we see when we look at the residential class. I've got a couple of charts that I'm going to show you. But that was our first step, is to evaluate the usage patterns of these customer classes, just like we did for residential, single-family residential. The second component of evaluating these tiers is to look at it and ask ourselves, is there a clear approach for assigning the tier thresholds? I just mentioned that for single family residential, we dug into usage indoors for certain household sizes. And then we looked at peaking characteristics for outdoor usage for residential. So it was a little clearer to apply those thresholds across the entire residential class. However, if you try to apply that same structure or that same rationale to commercial usage, we have such a wide variety of types of commercial entities that we felt that it wasn't appropriate. So we talked about meter size, so perhaps scaling those thresholds by meter size. And that would be great, except how do you justify the certain types of connections that, say, perhaps have a larger meter, but serve multiple entities, say in a strip mall, where you have a dentist office and a restaurant or something like that. So there's a fast food restaurant. So there are a number of reasons why we felt that the current tiered structure, even by meter size, would not apply. And then finally, the understanding of the effect on customers. If you go back to our priorities, yes, water conservation is a priority, and so is revenue stability and affordability, et cetera. So we also asked ourselves, is the intent to reduce all usage or just outdoor usage? Many non-residential customers have a separate landscape meter for their outdoor usage. So that was one element we wanted to look at. And then secondly, Aaron presented the historical usage in gallons per day for different types of usage. And I believe we saw, and Aaron, you can confirm if I'm remembering correctly, that we saw a reduction not only in household or residential gallons per day, but also on the non-residential side, we saw savings over the past few years. So we felt that all usage was actually being affected by the cities and by Water Services conservation program and conservation practices. There's a couple other elements here. I just wanted to mention that proportionality again. We want to make sure that that proportionality within a class is paid attention to, as well as this last point that when we talked about this the last time we met, I missed this point, which I shouldn't have. So when we are making changes during a cost of service study, we typically don't make a number of large changes. We typically ease into changes. So we know that the revenue requirements and aligning the water services, water fund, wastewater fund, and even the reclaimed water fund to the effects of inflation that has happened since the last rate study and the last rate increases. That's a large increase. I won't deny that. It's a significant increase and impact, and will impact many of your customers. So that large adjustment will already affect your non-residential customers. If you decide, if the city and city council decides to address those impacts first, and then maybe later on down, maybe in your next rate study or in the period between, that you start studying and looking into different rate structures. So for non-residential customers, looking into usage patterns and perhaps looking into your billing system to see if it could handle a different rate structure for your other classes. If that would be a more phased in approach of this type of rate structure for your non-residential classes. So all of that we did go through as we were developing these, the rate alternatives for your review and for city council's review. I'll talk a little bit about the background for looking at usage patterns. And, now that I'm looking at these charts, I should have represented the single family residential usage distribution because it looks like a normal bell curve. And it's easy to see where the thresholds apply to that usage pattern. This chart has a lot going on. I'm just going to go over it pretty quickly. On the left is the bill count. So in a year, this is not number of accounts. It is number of bills sent out during a year. So this was fiscal year 2023 for the commercial class. And out of all the bills sent out each month, we could tally how many were sent out for different levels of usage. So the 1,000 gallons of usage is along the bottom. And they're in increments of 500 gallons up until here. And that's when we switched our scale because we'd be here forever and the chart would not fit on the screen because there are many, many large users. These are all meter sizes combined, by the way. On the right is the percentages, and the percentages are associated with the green and yellow lines here. The yellow line is a cumulative distribution of the bills issued for each level of usage, so that by the time you get to this 25,000 gallons of monthly water use, you're billing about 75% of all the bills for your commercial class. That's 3/4 of your commercial bills sent out for 25,000 gallons or less of usage. The remaining 25% make up actually 90% of the volume billed. So it's kind of astounding that 25% of the bills are for 90% of the volume used. So you see that what that tells me is that there are very large users. There's quite a few users under 25,000 gallons, but there are quite large monthly usages in that extra 25% of the bills. There is a lot to unpack here, and I'm sure we might need to have a separate conversation, but I just wanted to point this out, that this was one of the first indications that it would be difficult to set up specific thresholds. The same is true for the landscape customers. It's the same picture, and I know we had to change the scale because monthly usage for landscape customers is not only constrained to the irrigation months, but it's a lot of usage. So we have a similar picture and a similar inflection point that is based on changing the scale of the usage, because otherwise we couldn't fit this usage on the screen. So what we see here is that out of about the same 75% of the bills for landscape users, that is for approximately 20% of the volume. So the remaining 25% of bills is for 80% of the volume in the landscape class. The bottom line is that we, in conjunction with discussions with your conservation program director and customer service and water services, is that at this point, it was not justified to set up tiers for non-residential classes. That was a lot. If you have any questions that I could answer at this point, I'd be happy to talk through it.
You can't tell us who some of these big users are, is that correct?
That's correct. I'm sure that water services could probably find general categories.
Okay, I'm sorry, I guess I understand why. My thought process was we need to encourage conservation by these big users, but okay, never mind.
The 80-20 rule is a powerful thing. So, yeah.
I'll just say that I would still like to look at this issue some more. It's water over the dam at this point, so to speak. And look at some other parameters, so.
John, it's water under the bridge. Not over the dam. Okay, I also realize the ship has sailed on this for this round, but I would like to have further conversations and understand, in light of what you've presented here, how is it that over 50% of Arizona communities do find a way to do tiered rates for commercial users? You know, how have they either overcome these issues, or do they just say, tough, we'll do it anyway? And I'm not expecting an answer today, but let's have that conversation later.
Okay, Carol.
All right. Thank you. And noted. Okay, let's move on to wastewater. We're almost done. The wastewater rate structure that was selected was was a combination of a fixed charge and consolidation of the volume classes. We called that option 3. And again, the total wastewater bill that we're showing here would be a combination of the fixed meter charge per month and the volume charge for your billed sewer flow. The monthly fixed meter charges are not in existence right now, so your current wastewater rate structure does not have a monthly fixed charge, but the proposed charge would be set to recover 25% of the annual wastewater funds revenue required. The remaining 75% of the revenue requirement would be recovered through the volume rates. The current classes are here, and as was mentioned earlier, the classes are currently established based on strength of flows. So car washes and laundromats, etc. They have separate rates based on their strength of their wastewater flow. The proposed consolidation groups like concentrations of their strengths of flow together, so like classes. We're proposing non-residential A, B, and C, with A including car washes through hotels and motels. So those concentrations that are and pounds of wastewater discharge are in a certain class. So those are all grouped together, and the volume rate there would be $4.45 for fiscal year 25. The higher strength customers are in the group would be restaurants, industrial laundries, and pet food manufacturers. So that higher strength would be billed at $7.05 per thousand. And then the highest strength customer is in a class by itself, and that would be a very high strength that I know that already communications have been started with that particular non-residential group C. Again, these are inside city rates. There would be a 10% surcharge for outside city rates. The rate structure that we were talking about, option 3, and the projection of the 5 years of rates is listed here. Again, this is the new part of the schedule, so you would have a similar table to the water fixed charges and the reclaimed water fixed charges. These rates, of course, would be in effect September 1st of this year, and they would go longer than 12 months, so they would go through December 31st of 2025, and then the rate adjustments would be on January 1st every year thereafter. And I should mention, I can't believe I didn't mention this yet, but I think that, Mr. Chair, you mentioned this. You can go online to cleanwaterflagstaff.com and put in your bill and look at an estimated bill impact. So we have a bill calculator online that will forecast as long as you go all the way out to 2029, if you like. Similar to the water fund, we're showing the wastewater bills projected for some typical representative customers. So we have, again, we're only showing the total bill as the wastewater fixed charge plus the wastewater volume charge. And again, I'll start with residential. That representative meter size is 3/4 inches. And we're using the wastewater billing data. So that's why we have an average bill of 4.88. So 4,880 gallons. The current water bill for that particular customer would be $26.13 today. And then with this change, it would go up $12.24 a month. So you'll notice, and this is again, like I mentioned for water, this is the adjustment in the first year effective September 1. This is the adjustment for the cost of service analysis and the new revenue requirements for fiscal year 25. So that percentage change is larger and different across customer classes. You'll see some customer types with a decrease in their wastewater bill. And that again is a completely result of the cost of service analysis. That is the case for September 1, 2024. So that would be the first adjustment. Thereafter, every customer, every bill would see that percentage change that would be the same. This would be across the board 25% on the bill for the second adjustment, January 1 of 2026. And then it would be a 15% adjustment in 2027, 10%, and then 5% based on our current financial plan and forecast.
A question for you, Carol. Why is the ice cream cone manufacturer getting hit so much harder than anybody else, even more than the pet food? Is it something about their waste stream?
Mr. Chair, I'm sorry, I wasn't watching, but it certainly is. And through discussions and through looking at the actual concentrations discharged, if we take those two types of manufacturers as an example, one manufacturer has improved its pretreatment and treatment practices, whereas the other has not. So with higher strength waste discharge, that drives up the proportionate share of costs that are strength related, therefore more cost of service are allocated to that customer. So by improving the pre-treatment practices, this rate could be affected in the future.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Carol.
Okay, thanks. A couple more slides. We have two slides that show a combined bill impact for two typical customers. Way back at the beginning of this study, we looked at some typical municipal services bills. One was for a residential customer using 4,550 gallons. So every every component of that customer's bill was presented. So what they actually see when they receive their bill. The items in yellow are what we are talking about tonight for this customer. So the water charges here and the wastewater charges here. The other charges are also part of a customer's bill. You've heard about the energy surcharge. And in fact, we know that will change in the future, but for our proposal for projecting a bill to 2029, we don't know what that will be at this point. So we're holding it constant. It is unlikely to be constant. As well as the water protection fees. So those two fees will likely be different and affect this bill in 2029. But there is a stormwater fee component, solid waste charge, all of these items and state and local taxes get added to a customer's bill. We just wanted to show that given the current rate structure and the current rates in this year, 2024, that customer's total bill would be just over $100. In 2025, with the proposed changes to the water and wastewater rates and rate structures, we would see an increase in that bill to $115.94. But then there are other components that are going up as well. So in the next year that, or after implementation of these proposed rates, the bill would be $115.94. And then fast forward to 2029, we're projecting around $168. So just to give you an idea that, you know, the bill that a customer will see in 2029 versus today. We show the same thing for a commercial customer. This particular customer has a 3/4 inch water meter and uses 51,750 gallons in a month. And you'll see that the estimated bill today is just under $1,000. After the changes, the bill would be 1,010. And then by 2029, 1,450. So these are all estimates, but it just gives you an idea of what we're facing. You might wonder what happened to reclaimed. It's my last set of slides. So the reclaimed water rates, as we discussed, they are still set to be investigated over the next 6 months. So given where we stand today with the current reclaimed water rates as a percentage of the potable water rates, and given the proposed water rates, we've calculated the projected reclaimed water rates for the next 5 years. Please note that the monthly fixed charges for reclaimed water are the same as for potable water. There's no proportion of the potable water rate. They pay the same. But reclaimed water, if you get out your calculator, the actual reclaimed rate is the percentage that's listed on this chart of potable water rates, but it's the potable water rate plus the energy surcharge rate, or the energy rate, excuse me. So you have to add those two together before you apply the percentage of potable to get your reclaimed water rate. Thank you for sitting through a review of all of these charges, rates and charges that come out of the cost of service study. So we looked at all of these components except non-rate revenues. However, these are all important factors to understand when looking at the big picture.
Thank you, Carol. Again, excellent.
Thanks.
I think everybody can read this and figure out next steps. But I do think it's going to be important that we help communicate the key factor that Director Jones was talking about in terms of we build this way because we're trying to really align payment with use so that everybody in the city understands that. But any other quick questions or comments? Okay, great. Thanks, Carol.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Evening. Okay,
Thanks, Carol.
Move into item 6, information items, 2 from the chair. I've got 2 quick things, but does anybody have anything else?
This will be quick, and that's all I'm going to say. The PFAS is at the fan. As you know, the EPA has finally established potable water or drinking water standards for PFAS. And I talked to somebody with ADEQ, and she says there's a whole bunch of stuff going on with EPA right now to try and determine how that's going to affect reclaim regulations. So sooner or later down the road, we probably will need to be discussing such matters.
Progress.
I believe they're recommended standards. They aren't really actual standards yet. Okay, well, let's.
And then we have to figure out how to test for it. Okay. So,
There we go. Yeah.
so two quick things. Carol did mention we're doing, or somebody did mention, I'm in a fog, a 6-month sort of strategic review around reclaimed. And so, Director Jones, I gave him kind of a framework to kick around of the types and buckets of things. I think we'll be putting a working group together And by default, Commissioner Vane is on that group. So. And so, but to go through the types, current numbers, what are we really using? What's happening? What are the dynamics, real numbers on cost and generation, real users, and then sort of looking out in the future, what do we want it to look like? Different scenarios, right? So I think it's real critical that we have that. We owe that to the city council, I think, because they're not the experts here. And that'll be a good tool to help them set policy. And the second thing I'd say real quick is 6 month. It just fell out of my head. So it must have been on. Oh, yes. So we'll be drafting sort of a position, if you will, a supportive position to the city council about this whole process. And I think we'll go through each one of these buckets and sort of highlight, for example, the parts around here's the assumptions, here's the assumptions that we all think are valid, especially these larger assumptions. We think that's the right approach. We think we considered the right things here, and either we're unanimous or we're in a majority about how we view that item, so that the city council gets a gauge of where we're at, and they've got a little bit of help, if you will, when it comes time to make decisions. So those are my two items. We'll send a draft to everybody before the next meeting, and then we can comment and sort of lock it down, and you can make comments directly back to Marion. Kind of like what we did with the stormwater. We sort of drafted something to city council and said, hey, here we go, right? And everybody was pretty good with it, and I got some great feedback from everybody. So it'll be a collaborative process. It's not, so.
Just a quick one on the reclaimed rates. Those conversations tend to be slow, so if we, and painful. And so if we owe a response to council within 6 months, I think we should start reasonably promptly. And then the one other element of that, in addition to the things you listed, would be that understanding the way the enterprise fund is set up today, under the notion that at least one approach to rates is to be cost-based. And for that, we need to understand how the enterprise fund is set up. And so I'm looking at Rick Tatter thinking at some point we'd love to sit down in whatever the appropriate format is and walk through that and understand how that is captured today. So thank you.
Any other items? 1, 2, 3? No? Okay, good. So then we'll move to item 6, which is adjournment at 6:22 p.m. And Aaron, please do communicate to Carol her exceptional performance in all of these. So we appreciate it. And thank you. Happy birthday to, oh, she's gone, I think, but happy birthday to Council Member Sweet. Yes. Yeah, dialing in from Mexico during her birthday. That's above and beyond, So that's right. So thank you, everybody, and we'll see everybody next month.